Welcome to the Podkey summary of traumatic brain injury. Today's catch-up is about traumatic brain injury, and one of the biggest takeaways is that it's often far less visible and far more complicated than people assume. A brain injury can look mild on a scan and still seriously affect thinking, mood, judgment, and everyday life. And the story doesn't stop at the moment of impact, because a lot of the damage unfolds afterward, while treatment, prevention, and long-term support all make a real difference. Traumatic brain injury isn't just the dramatic movie version where there's obvious bleeding or a skull fracture. The brain can be injured by rapid acceleration and deceleration, by rotational forces, by blast waves, or by a penetrating object. And some of those injuries can disrupt brain function even when an early CT or MRI looks normal. That's part of why this area gets misunderstood. People tend to trust what they can see, but the brain does not always cooperate with that instinct. In general, inertial forces are more likely to cause diffuse injuries, especially diffuse axonal injury, where damage is spread across brain connections. A direct blow is more likely to cause focal injuries like contusions, lacerations, or hematomas. And plenty of patients have both patterns at the same time, which is one reason no two cases really unfold the same way. Clinicians still use the Glasgow Coma Scale as the standard way to rate severity. Scores of 13 to 15 are generally called mild, 9 to 12 moderate, and 3 to 8 severe. It's useful, but it's not a crystal ball. It helps describe the situation in front of you, not predict exactly how one individual person will do months later. One of the most important ideas here is secondary brain injury. The initial trauma is only the first hit. After that, over minutes to days, you can get inflammation, disruption of the blood-brain barrier, excess glutamate activity, calcium and sodium rushing into cells, mitochondrial dysfunction, reduced blood flow, swelling, and rising intracranial pressure. That chain reaction helps explain why someone can deteriorate after they've already reached the hospital, which is obviously terrifying for families and a huge challenge for care teams. These secondary processes account for a large share of in-hospital deaths, and in the worst cases, they can reduce cerebral perfusion so much that it leads to herniation or brain death. That's why emergency treatment focuses so hard on basics that are actually not basic at all. Keeping oxygenation up, maintaining blood pressure, protecting cerebral blood flow, controlling seizures, and managing intracranial pressure. There's also evidence that tranexamic acid, if it's given within 3 hours of head injury, can reduce mortality. A really hard part of TBI is that someone may look physically fine and still be struggling in ways that are profound and very real. Damage often affects the orbitofrontal and anterior temporal regions, which are deeply involved in social behavior, emotion, smell, judgment, and decision-making. So, a survivor may walk and talk normally, but family members notice a personality shift, worse impulse control, bad judgment, or behavior that suddenly feels unfamiliar. Alexithymia is a big example of this. About 60.9% of people with TBI have difficulty identifying, understanding, or describing their emotions. On top of that, there can be problems with attention, processing speed, executive function, and social judgment. The ripple effects can include depression, anxiety, impulsivity, disinhibition, anger, inappropriate sexual behavior, and substance abuse. And when depression develops after TBI, suicide risk rises sharply, about 2 to 3 times higher. This is where diagnosis gets especially frustrating. A normal CT or MRI does not rule out a mild TBI or concussion. MRI can show more detail and may pick up diffuse axonal injury later on, but it's slower, less practical in emergencies, and not as strong for acute bleeding and fractures. So people can have persistent post-concussion symptoms while standard imaging looks unremarkable, which has fueled a long-running debate over how much those symptoms reflect subtle brain tissue disruption, psychological factors, or some mix of both. Researchers are trying to get better tools into the picture, including diffusion tensor imaging, high-definition fiber tracking, quantitative EEG, eye tracking tests, microdialysis, and cerebral oxygen monitoring. The hope is better detection, better prognosis, and honestly, a little more clarity for patients who are tired of hearing that everything looks normal. On the public health side, TBI is a major cause of death and disability worldwide, especially for children, adolescents, and young adults. Males sustain these injuries about twice as often as females, and have roughly 4 times the risk of fatal head injury. In the US, about 2 million people experience TBI each year. Around 675,000 cases reach emergency departments, and roughly 500,000 people are hospitalized. Falls are the main driver for young children and older adults, while transportation accidents, violence, sports, firearms, and workplace injuries matter a lot in other groups. The mechanism really matters for outcome. Estimated U.S. survival is about 89% for fall-related TBI, but only 9% for firearm-related TBI. And globally, the burden is growing as populations age and vehicle use expands in lower-income countries. A lot of prevention comes down to regular safety systems that are easy to take for granted. Seatbelts, child restraints, motorcycle helmets, speed limits, safer roads, fall-proof bathrooms and stairs, locked firearms, and rules against dangerous sports contact can all reduce how often these injuries happen and how severe they are. Sports and recreation alone account for an estimated 1.6 to 3.8 million TBIs each year in the United States. Repeated concussions and even repetitive soccer heading have raised concern about cumulative injury, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy can appear years after repeated head trauma. Protective gear helps, but it has limits. Helmets can reduce certain impacts, but they can't eliminate concussion risk or fully protect against rotational and inertial forces. That's the annoying truth about prevention sometimes. The equipment matters, but the surrounding behavior and environment matter just as much. Treatment in severe cases is often a race against swelling, intracranial pressure, and reduced cerebral perfusion. Mannitol and hypertonic saline can help bring swelling down. Temporary hyperventilation can also lower pressure, but it comes with a real trade-off because it can reduce blood flow too much and cause cerebral ischemia, so it's usually reserved for short-term use. A lot of neuroprotective ideas that looked promising in animal studies just have not translated into clear clinical benefit in people, including NMDA receptor antagonists and therapeutic hypothermia. Routine corticosteroids are a clear warning sign in this literature because they increase mortality and are not recommended. And decompressive craniectomy, where part of the skull is removed to relieve pressure, can lower intracranial pressure and shorten ICU stays, but in some severe diffuse injuries, it's also linked with higher rates of death, vegetative state, or severe disability than standard medical therapy. So even when a treatment makes physiological sense, the real-world outcome picture can be a lot messier than anyone wants. The long-term recovery story is more hopeful and more demanding than the old 6-month narrative suggests. Neurological improvement can continue for 2 years or longer, and what looks like an early plateau may partly reflect rehab services being pulled back, not the brain hitting some hard biological deadline. Rehabilitation is usually multidisciplinary: physical, occupational, speech, vision, cognitive, psychological, vocational, and community-based support all have a role. More than 90% of people with moderate TBI may eventually live independently, which is encouraging, but many still need help with work, finances, or physical tasks. And recovery never belongs only to the injured person. TBI can reorganize an entire family by changing roles, communication, stress, and expectations. Psychoeducation, counseling, supported employment, respite care, and community services can reduce some of that disruption for both survivors and caregivers. If there's a theme running through all of this, it's that brain injury is often invisible. evolving, and bigger than the first emergency room snapshot. Prevention matters, fast treatment matters, and long-term support matters just as much as the initial diagnosis. And if someone says they're still not the same after a head injury, even when the scan looked fine, that's worth taking seriously. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.